And we're going to start the story in 1901 when she was 11 years old. And she lived with her mother and father and 5 siblings in a southern Mississippi town near New Orleans. And one day, her parents announced that they were moving the family to South Florida. So after a long and difficult journey by train, they arrived in the South Florida town of Punta Gorda. But that wasn't their destination. From Punta Gorda, they took a steamboat through the waterways to the town of Fort Myers. And in Fort Myers, they stayed while their father shopped for supplies and bought an ox and an ox cart. And early one morning, they set out on a journey south, a 20-mile journey on a sand road in the woods. And around noon the following day, they arrived at the headwaters, the shallow headwaters of a river, and they crossed that and followed the south bank to a pioneer settlement called Survey. Now they were really amazed and surprised to find just about the entire community of Survey came out to greet them. I don't think many people came their way. And before long, they were gifted with a milk cow and some sweet potatoes to start a garden. And the town folk helped them build a temporary shelter of a mud and log cabin with a thatched roof. Several months later, a unseasonable flood came and destroyed the log cabin. But the town folks got together and found them a more suitable and permanent place to stay. About 3 years after they had settled in Survey, a dashing young man, J.W. Liles, who was 15 years older than Lula, came and began courting Lula. And in a year, they were married. And they lived temporarily with a family in Survey, hoping one day to have a home of their own. But while they were there, J.W. had a job opportunity to the south. So he and Lula moved south to an isolated cabin near Henderson Creek. There was hardly any humans around except for the Seminole men and women who used to come to the clearing around the cabin and sit and watch them through the day. And one time when a person came from Survey to visit Lula, she said, "Aren't you afraid of them?" And she said, "Not really." She said, "It just seems like they just want to know how we live." While they were in this cabin, Lula discovered that she was going to have a child. And so they enlisted a local midwife in that area. And Lula's younger sister, Effie, came down from Survey to attend to the birth. And after the child was born, Effie stayed on for several weeks helping out. Among her duties was to row a boat out into the bay and wash out the baby's diapers. When the baby was 1 year old, J.W. and Lula, the job was finished, and J.W. and Lula moved back to Survey. This time they were going to build a home. The first process of building their home was to clear all the tall pine trees from the property and drag them to the river and float them through the waterways to the Croatian settlement in Estero, where J.W. traded the logs for milled lumber and loaded it on wagons drawn by horses and brought it back to Survey, and he began construction of his home. He didn't have much of the framing up. He hadn't quite finished it when the settlement got word that a hurricane was headed their way. And J.W. thought it best to be on solid ground, so he formed a little fort out of mattresses in the midst of a scrub oak patch, and he and his wife and child rode out the storm there. And after the storm, when they returned to the home site, they discovered that the wind had blown all the framing down, so they had to salvage the lumber and start all over again. But with the help of J.W.'s brother Marvin, in less than 3 months, they were nailing cypress shakes on the roof, and thus began Lula's role as a pioneer homemaker. She had no electricity, no indoor plumbing. Her transportation was horse and buggy. She used a hand pump for water. She washed her clothes in a wash pot with a washboard. She cared for chickens. She milked a cow. She tended to the beehives. And J.W., being an excellent hunter, brought home wild game and fish, which she learned to process and cook on a wood stove. Her determined, can-do personality led her to be a foremost midwife in Survey, and also was a highly respected leader in the community. Years later, their family grew to 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. And Lula worked in the school and the lunch area, and also served as a nurse in the little school in Survey. About that time, Florida was booming, and developers had begun developing a community west of Survey called Bonita Springs. And so J.W. and Lula, having foresight, decided to sell their home in Survey and invest in a rooming house in the town of Bonita Springs. It took a year to build, but after the first year, once it was in operation, they were surprised that it filled up immediately, and for the next 2 years they never had a vacancy. And Lula saw an opportunity for another business, and she opened a laundry, which was also very successful. But in the 3rd year, the disappointment came of a Great Depression, and soon their business was down to a trickle, and soon there was no business at all. And so Lula and the children moved to Fort Myers, where there was some work available, and they supported themselves, and J.W. stayed in Bonita Springs with his truck making money, and to weather out the Depression. As the Depression waned down, Lula and the children moved back to Bonita, and by then the rooming house had been claimed by the bank. But they invested in a small house on Wilson Street in Bonita, where they raised all their children to adulthood. In their latter years, they enjoyed being surrounded by all their grandchildren, and they enjoyed sitting side by side watching the sunset. After 45 years of marriage, J.W. passed away, and 2 years later, after an adventurous life, Lula followed him. So I want to thank y'all for listening to my story of my grandmother. She was truly a great woman, and I hope you learned a little more about Bonita Springs. Good night.